It was just an ordinary day last spring when a woman was working in her garden, keeping an eye on her 5-year-old daughter and a friend as they played in the backyard. They were playing church. Seems Mom was a minister, and this is what ministers' kids do. She overheard her daughter tell her friend to go and get the water hose and turn it on. And while the friend did that, the little 5-year-old girl grabbed a small bucket, and then she motioned for her friend to bring the water hose over and fill up the bucket. Then she said in a commanding voice, "Stand back. I am going to turn this ordinary water into holy wine just like Jesus did." And she lifted her hands and she closed her eyes and launched into an elaborate prayer that only made sense to a 5-year-old. She took a deep breath, held the bucket up to her mouth, and took a long, long gulp of the water. Her eyes got big, a big smile on her face. She said, "Wow, guess what? Holy wine tastes just like ordinary water." Let us pray. Good and gracious God, whose love is never ending, may our hearts and minds be open to your possibilities. May we have the eyes to see and the ears to hear the many ways in which ordinary water can become the holy wine of salvation and healing in our lives and in this world that you hold so dear. And may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable to you and to the purposes of your kingdom. Amen. Well, today we're looking at the story of Ruth. Kind of an ordinary woman, isn't she? She wasn't a warrior heroine who saved her nations like Judith. She wasn't one who gave her testimony in such a beautiful way as in the book of Esther. We think of her, or I do, as a more demure woman whose claim to fame is a lovely speech about loyalty and faithfulness, words that we just heard Bree Mercer sing so beautifully. Thank you again, Bree. Loyalty, devotion, faithfulness. Sounds a little like a golden retriever, doesn't it? But Ruth has a lot to show us about what it means to be a follower of God, a faithful one. So this summer, since we're looking at women in the Bible, today we're going to get a nice close look at this sweet, gentle woman named Ruth. Or maybe she's not so sweet and gentle after all. So let me tell you the story. It's 4 chapters long. I'll try to summarize it the best I can. The story is set in the time of the Judges, which is very early in Hebrew history, a time when they didn't have a king, they were a loose association of tribes, and they were ruled over by the judges. The story focuses in on a single man from Bethlehem, a name which means land of bread, or land of food. Now, this man, along with his wife and his 2 sons, are experiencing a famine. There's a famine in the land of food. Now, already you start to see some irony coming in here. The famine in the land of food. Well, this man takes his wife and his 2 sons, and they move to Moab, which means land of the despised enemy. So, before I go too much further, I've just alluded to 2 names in here, the names of 2 places. Names of places, names and characters in the book of Ruth play a really important role. And as Westerners, and unless you speak Hebrew, which I don't either, but unless you know that, you are going to miss an awful lot in this story. A lot of the irony and the depth of meaning comes from their names. So, let's just look at this a little bit. We have Bethlehem, the land of food, and we have them leaving that because there's a famine, and they're going to Moab, the land of the despised enemy, in search of salvation. Let's continue. Elimelech, the man, takes his wife Naomi, which means pleasant one, and he takes his 2 sons with him, Maon and Chilion. Now, listen carefully to this, because their names mean something like sickly and diseased. The man, his wife pleasant one, and sickly and diseased, settled in the land of their enemies. And right off the bat, this isn't sounding very promising, is it? So the story starts out in suffering, and the suffering continues, because while they're in Moab, the man dies, leaving pleasant one a widow. Now, being a widow is bad enough in that culture, but being a widow in a foreign land is even worse, and not such a friendly foreign land at that. And remember, she does still have 2 sons, but, well, I don't know about you, but if the only thing I had to depend on were 2 boys named Sickly and Diseased, I wouldn't find much comfort in that. But the boys marry. They marry Moabite women from the land of the despised enemy. And again, we get the picture. This is not sounding promising, is it? The brides' names were Orpah and Ruth. Now, speaking of the meaning of names, Orpah's name means something like back of the head or back of the neck, and that's going to come into play a little bit further along in the story. And just as a sidebar, in case you're wondering, yes, Oprah Winfrey was named for Orpah, but somebody got the spelling wrong. So file that into the category of did you know? Anyway, back to the story. It doesn't linger. We quickly find out that sickly and diseased die. No surprise there, right? Which now leaves the story about 3 widows, 1 who's a foreigner and 2 who are without children. And this doesn't take much to know that, again, not good. Naomi, or pleasant one, decides there's no future for her in land of the despised enemy. She finds out the famine in land of bread has ended, so she packs up to return home and prepares to say goodbye to these 2 daughters-in-law. The young women argue with her fiercely. They love pleasant one. They do not want to leave. They want to stay with her. But she'll have none of it. What kind of future could you possibly have with me, she asked. I have no other sons or next of kin for you to marry. Now, what's she talking about there? She's talking about Levirate law, which is a way of continuing a family name by marrying widows to other male relatives in the family. She says, I have no more. And then she says, kind of comedically, you certainly don't want to wait around for me to have 2 more sons, do you? I mean, even if I got pregnant tonight, you'd still have to wait a long time for them to grow up. We're supposed to laugh at that. It's absurd. So, no, she says, go back to your homes, marry again, have families, and may God's steadfast love be for you as your steadfast love has been for me. Do you hear that word? May God's steadfast love for you be like your steadfast love has been for me. Now, this coming from a woman who now says that God has cursed her. She kisses both the daughters-in-law. All 3 weep, the only time we see weeping in the story, and Naomi turns to leave. Orpah understands the reality of the situation, and even though it pains her, she turns around, literally shows the back of her head, and began her journey home. But not Ruth. Ruth, it says, clung to Naomi. And that word clung in Hebrew is the same one that is used in the Genesis passage when we are told that a man and a woman cling to one another and become one flesh. It's an intimate verb. It implies deep devotion and an unwillingness to let go under any circumstances. Ruth clung to Naomi. Very out of the ordinary. Naomi's shocked. Haven't you been listening? You're a woman, that's strike 1. You're a widow, that is strike 2. And you're a foreigner, a Moabite, strike 3. You're out. Get out of here. Beat it. I would, wouldn't you? I wouldn't hang around, but not Ruth. She stubbornly refuses, and this is when she utters that beautiful speech. Do not force me to leave you or abandon you or turn back from following you. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people, they'll be my people. Your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and where you are buried, I will be buried. Now that is quite a pledge from a daughter-in-law. She's giving Naomi everything. Everything she has to offer. Her constant companionship, her Moabite nationality and religion, her death, her burial, her future. In short, she is giving Naomi everything that she has been, all that she is, and all that she might hope to be. All given over to this widow, Naomi. Naomi's response? She's speechless, literally. She doesn't speak to Ruth the whole way home. And so the scene ends with these two women silently trudging their way back to Bethlehem to a most uncertain future. Chapter 1. We pick up chapter 2. The story continues, and we see these two women doing what they must do in order to survive in a very dangerous and precarious world, especially for women. Naomi reconnects with her old friends, and when they call her Pleasant One, as they always had, she corrects them. No. Don't call me Pleasant One, she says. From now on, you call me Mara, which means bitter one. Because when I left here, I was full, and now the Lord has brought me back empty, and I am bitter. Now hold on. Wait a minute. Did you hear what Naomi just said? Here is this woman who left because of starvation, very empty, wouldn't you say? And she left with her husband and two sons named sickly and diseased. Was she really full? Was her memory really that bad? This woman is bitter, and bitterness seems to have skewed her sense of reality and her memory. Then she says that it was the Lord that brought her back empty. But hasn't she noticed? Hasn't she noticed this young woman standing right there next to her? A woman who pledged her whole being to her mother-in-law and her well-being? A woman named Ruth, whose name means joy and blessing. It's closer to saying, my cup runneth over. Her friends must have looked at her and looked at one another and wondered if she had spent way too much time in the hot sun. What was she thinking? Bitter? Bitter she was, bitter she would be for right now. Now the next two chapters entail Ruth going out into the field to glean barley so that she and her mother-in-law can survive. It means that Ruth is going to go out into some farmer's field that she doesn't know and pick up the leftovers from the harvest. Gleaning in that culture was kind of an Israelite welfare system. Those who gathered in the crops were not supposed to glean so clean that there were no leftovers. Those were to be left behind for the poor, for the widows, for the orphans, for the foreigners to come in and pick up. That is the way they survived. Now, the owner of this particular field, we are told, is a man named Boaz, which means quality and strength of character. And it just so happens that Boaz is a relative. I thought they didn't have any relatives. Boaz notices Ruth. And we can't miss the fact that a young woman, a widow with no man to protect her, gleaning in the fields by herself is not in just a little bit of danger. Gleaning might have been a way of taking care of the poor, but this did not guarantee their safety. This was risky. Ruth has no one to protect her. But when you're desperate, you do risky things. Boaz notices Ruth. He sees her gleaning, and he asks his workers about her. Do they know her name? Who is this woman? And he finds out she is kin through Naomi and Elimelech. And people have been talking in the community about this remarkable young woman who has come home with her mother-in-law. What a beautiful story of love and fierce loyalty. And Boaz is impressed with this. So he tells his workers to leave her in peace. Keep your eyes and your hands off of her, he says. Leave her alone. And then he tells them not only to leave a little bit behind, but go ahead and take a little bit of the grain out of your own harvest and toss that on the ground as well. He wants to be sure She is well fed and well cared for. Then he goes over and he does something outrageous in this culture. He speaks to her. He speaks to her, and then he offers her water from his own water jar. And as one commentator on this passage said, this is a story of a remarkable social climb. She has really climbed the ladder, hasn't she, in status? Now, when Naomi finds out about the family connection, it is like a cup of cold water has been splashed in her face. Her whole mood seems to change. She hops up and she begins to do some matchmaking. Whoopee, she tells Ruth, put on your best clothes. Go ahead, wear your pearls, put on some perfume, get all dolled up. We've got some courting to do. Now get down there to that threshing floor. Ruth's eyes must have opened wide. Get down there to that threshing floor tonight. Go down there and Boaz will tell you what to do. Okay, now we really need to stop here and be sure we understand what's going on. You know what Naomi, Mara, bitter, is asking, right? This is risky. The threshing floor at midnight? The threshing floor has a less than virtuous reputation. Let's just say that if a single woman is caught going down to the threshing floor at night alone, this is not good for your reputation. All kinds of things could happen to her there, and she knows this. She has no protection. She is completely vulnerable. This is a make or break situation for her. So Ruth does what her mother-in-law tells her to do, except when she gets there, she does veer from the plan. And we've already seen that Ruth is an independent thinker, and she's no different here. She does go down to the threshing floor like her mother-in-law has told her, a very risky thing to do, but she goes further in that she takes the initiative on the threshing floor. She doesn't wait for Boaz to tell her what to do. She does what I will politely offer him a marriage proposal. It's an innuendo. Think about it. Without going into detail, the language used truly is not ambiguous here. Ruth makes herself completely vulnerable to Boaz. He can take advantage of her, and he will suffer no consequences, but she will be ruined. She and her mother-in-law. But it's a risk she's going to take. She goes for broke. She's courageous, she's bold, and she's got her fingers crossed that this is going to work. She takes the initiative. Ruth takes the initiative, but don't miss, Boaz has the power. She doesn't wait to do what her mother-in-law advised. She knows what she wants, what she needs, and she goes for it. Here's what she says: spread your cloak over me. And folks, she is not asking Boaz to share the covers, trust me. The fact that she leaves before the sun comes up tells us just how bold a move that really was. Now, after a brief sidetrack in the story about a relation that might be closer to her and have first rights to Ruth according to Levirate law, after that little bit in the story, we finally see Ruth and Boaz, and they are married. And just as quickly we learn that they have a child, a son who is named Obed, meaning servant. A son who becomes the grandfather of Israel's greatest and most notorious king, David. Now, this story is not about the child, and it's not about the love match between Ruth and Boaz, despite any number of biblical romance novels depicting a full-figured Ruth and a barrel-chested Boaz on the cover. That's not what it's about. The story's about Ruth. Ruth's story. A fact that is made clear by the women in the neighborhood at the close of this story. They bless God for the birth of Obed, but more than that, they remind Naomi what this story has been telling us from the very beginning. Your daughter-in-law, they say, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 Israelite sons, has given you a child, a new chance in life. The only time the word love is used in this entire story is right here. And the women are naming it for Naomi. This is love. This foreign widow, they say, a foreigner and a widow, is worth more than 7 Israelite sons. Do you know what they're saying? Because the number 7 is not just a literal term. It means as many sons as there might be, and that would be the greatest blessing for any woman in that culture. But it is Ruth who is the blessing. The most unlikely one to provide salvation becomes for Naomi and for the future of Israel. Ruth becomes the face and the presence of God. Now, as stories go, this one isn't all that remarkable. In the ancient world, 2 widows caring for each other, doing whatever they can to survive, it can't be that unique in a patriarchal world that they lived in. It probably happened a lot, a very ordinary thing. So what is it about this story that turns ordinary water into holy wine? 2 things. First, Ruth plays a remarkable place in the theological history of Israel. The story may have occurred in the days of the Judges, which is way back, but it was written down, circulated, and widely read much later in Israel's history because it served as a reminder to them. Let me go back over a little bit of that history. The Babylonians had invaded the northern and the southern kingdoms of Judah and Israel, and they had sent many of their finest, most of their finest, out into exile. How did they interpret this, the Jews? That God had given up on them, that they had not been obedient to the law to the extent that they should have, and so God had broken the covenant, as God had said, if you will be my people, I will be your God. But they thought, you know what? We had stopped caring for the poor. The words of the prophets had been harsh. They cared more about their own security, about their own good standing in God's eyes, than they cared about their neighbor. And they knew it. And God had punished them. Now, 50 years in exile, they are allowed to come back. Oh my gosh. We thought it had ended. God is giving us a second chance. God has been merciful and gracious to us. We get to come back. And you know what? We're not messing around with it. This time we're going to do it right, because God may be a God of second chances, but not third. So this is when we see the rise of the Pharisees. This is when we see fundamentalist Judaism come into play, because they're afraid. And when we're afraid, this is what we do. We hunker down. We get very legalistic. The Pharisees come in. They're the protectors of the law. And you know what the law says? The law says no foreign wives. No mixed breed children. Now, what do you think happened in 50 years in exile? Of course they married foreign wives. Of course they had mixed breed children. And now they had to send them out? Abandon them? In order to be righteous and acceptable to God? Really? And so we see the story of Ruth now from an old story being recirculated and retold as a way of saying it was a foreign wife, a widow, who became the face of God, not just to Naomi, but to the future of all of Israel, because she is the great-grandmother of King David. Think about that. Secondly, Hesed. The story of Ruth is a story about love and Hesed. Hesed means loving kindness. It means faithfulness. It means steadfast love, a fierce and bold love that does not and will not ever abandon, a love that goes far beyond feelings, but is choosing to act on behalf of the loved one always. Think about that. Hesed, that is the word that is used over and over and over again in the story of Ruth. That's what this story of an unremarkable, ordinary woman who rose to be the extraordinary face of God is about. Hesed. She becomes our model for faithfulness, not a belief system, not a creed, not a dogma that we can grasp tightly and stingily. No, Hesed, the gracious, loving kindness of God expressed through even the most ordinary of people, even in the most ordinary of circumstances. Ruth's is a story of Hesed. It is a parable, in a way, exemplifying the love of God to all people and what the face of God can look like. The steadfast, fierce, bold, gracious, compassionate love of God that will not abandon, even if we, like Naomi, are bitter and full of anger, full of self-righteousness, self-centeredness, and misguided loyalties. God's love will not cease. Ruth goes beyond the human tendency toward tribalism and opens up the godly possibility of inclusion, even as the other may very well turn out to be the face of God. And friends, I think this is a very important message for us today. I'm noticing more and more of what I might consider and you might call tribalism, not just in the Middle East, not just among terrorists, but tribalism for all of us. The tribe of our belief system, the tribe of our nation, the tribe of our ethnic group, the tribe of whatever, you name it, political party. We have labels, and those labels are what we use to say who's in and who's out. And usually that means the people who are in are like me and the people who are out are not. And we are fragmented. Our church, our denomination, our society, we're fragmented and at each other as if we're not somehow connected and dependent on one another, as if somehow God favors us and not them, which puts God in a really precarious place because we all know God's on our side. People, we're not called to be the Naomis of this world, bitter, fearful, resigned to suffering, blind to the face of God that might be standing right in front of us because it's a face that doesn't look like an insider. But if we look close enough, we might see the face of God reaching out to us with that steadfast, fierce love that God cannot help but offer us over and over and over again until maybe, just maybe, we will begin to see that love is our purpose. Love is our calling. We are called to be the face of God in this world. And it's an important message for us today and for all generations. Can we allow God to do what God does best? Turn our ordinary lives, our ordinary water, into the holy wine of blessing and new life for all people, everyone. May the strength of God's persistent love for us, let it be so in our lives. Amen.